Pashat Devarim, where Moshe Rabbeinu gives his final Musar to Klal Yisrael, which is Moshe Rabbeinu's final message. And in this Pasha we learn Hayil Moshe the Eretz HaTorah Azos. Rashi tells us the Shivim Lashon. The Moshe Rabbeinu explained the Torah in 70 languages. Why was it necessary for Moshe Rabbeinu to explain the Torah in all 70 languages? So the Chidush Yerim explains this was a hachana for Klal Yisrael and Galus. Regardless of where Klal Yisrael is, regardless of what language they speak, or what the mode of dress is of the people around them, we are going to adhere to the Torah and to apply it in terms of how a Ben Torah lives given his circumstances. That is the Shivim Lashon. That's the meaning of Moshe Rabbeinu explaining it in 70 different languages. Don't think that because you're there, the Torah doesn't apply to you. Don't think because you live in this era, the Torah doesn't apply to you. Moshe Rabbeinu explained that the same Torah is here and can be transplanted and explained and fulfilled regardless of what the national language is, regardless of what flag you're residing under. And that's what the Emes is the stress of Eila Hadvarim Asher Diber Moshe El Kol Yisrael. Kol Yisrael referring to every single Yid in all future generations. Bear in mind, wherever you are, whatever you are, however you are, Moshe Rabbeinu was talking to you in Mishnah Torah when we begin Eila Hadvarim. And that's why this is the Pasha before Tisha B'Av, because this is the Hachana for Galus. A reminder. We may be in Galus, but the Torah is here with us. So Moshe Rabbeinu tells us, Tenu Lachem Tzafayna. And the Medrash says, Hatzvinu Atzmachem. Hide. You know the famous Kliyaka that gives us the formula of survival in Galus. If the Ezra Hashem Yisbarach things work out for you, you can afford a nice carpet and a nice chandelier and a beautiful home. Hide it. Don't make it a huge picture window and let the guy in the street crane his head to look with envy, planting the seeds of hatred and jealousy. In addition to that kliyaka, the Medrash dashin, Tnu Lachem Tzafayna, Hatzinu Asmachem. Hide yourself. Baruch L'Torah. Run to the Torah. Those that hide toward the Torah will be helped, the Medrash says. Why is Torah called hidden, Tzafayna? Because the Or Harishon, the Or Haganis, the hidden light of Ma'aseh Bereshis, is hidden in the Torah, explains the Tzaddik. What's interesting to note is that the Yetzer Hara is also referred to as Tzafayni, because like the Torah, Lahavdil, the Yetzer Hara is hidden in the heart of a person. The Yetzer Hara can hide himself and appear like a tzaddik. The Yetzer Hara can convince a person to do the worst aveira in the world in the guise of, it's a mitzvah. The result is the most fascinating thing. For every nefesh in Klal Yisrael, there is a corresponding nefesh amongst the Ummah Olam. In other words, for every neshama of good down here in this world, there is someone else that is a neshama of Ra that corresponds to it. That is not to suggest that the Ummah Olam are all Ra, but for every good neshama amongst us, there is somewhere amongst the Ummah Olam a corresponding neshama of Ra. And because the two are sort of interlocked, therefore, the good neshama has within it some strains of the Ra, and even the good person may occasionally display some bad midas, or have a durchval, or make mistakes. And for that matter, the neshama of Ra has within it some toiv, some strains of the good neshama, its counterpart. Thus Chazal say, Zacha, the person is Zacha, Neutally takes Chelka, his own Chelik, the Chelik Chazere, Began Eden. And Chas v'Sholom the other way around as well. If he's not Zacha, he gets his own Chelik and the Chelik of his friend in Gehenna. Now, the first Zug, the first pair that stands out to us, where one was Zeh L'Uma Zeh, was Yaakov and Esav. Thus Yaakov asked, Hasileininah miyad Achi miyad Esav. In other words, the fact that we are brothers, the fact that we are interlocked automatically means that I am vulnerable to some of the strains of Esav's Ra, and therefore Yaakov was mispalel to root it out, to have the Mesiras Nefesh, to undo it from himself. Thus says Rav Tzaddik, Tenu Lachem Tzafayna. Hide yourself, run to the Torah, which is Torah Shabbat, that gives a person an understanding, an Eitzah and Teshiyah. And as a result, the other entity that is hiding in your heart, the Yetzer Hara, won't be able to hide. You will reveal him for what he is. Because through Limud HaTorah, one engages the Midas Emes of Yaakov Avinu, and the other part of our heart, which represents the Ra and could be confused for Taiv, becomes revealed. He goes on to another Inyan of Tzaddik explains that this Shabbos, this upcoming Shabbos, is referred to as Shabbos Chazayin. Chazayin is the first word of this week's Haftarah, but it doesn't really depict the essence of the Haftarah. Would it have not been more appropriate to refer to this week's Haftarah as Haftarah Teichacha, Shabbos Teichacha, Shabbos Churban, in all due respect to the first word of our Haftarah? There must be some reason that somehow the word Chazayin, which means to see on a deep level, that somehow personifies for us what this Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, is all about. So Tzaddik says, the Gemara says in Masechtas Yuma, the Keshenichnasu Hasaynim Laheichel Ro HaKruvim Meurim Zeh B'Zeh. When the Kruvim faced opposite each other, that was a sign that Klal Yisrael was not up to par. They were not doing Rotzain Shel Makkah. When the Kruvim were facing each other, that was a sign that Klal Yisrael was Oisim Rotzain Shel Makkah. Now here the Gemara says, K'shenichnasu Hasaynim Laheichel, they saw the Kruvim Meurim Zeh B'Zeh. Now could there be any more time that Klal Yisrael was not Oisim Rotzain Shel Makkah, more so than the time of the Churban, than the very moment that the Goyim broke into the Heichel? So how could it be that at that point there was an expression of intimacy between Kaviyachal HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Klal Yisrael? So there's a famous verse that Bnei Yissaschar says from the Maggid, and many others say, it's B'china Chayiv Adam Lifkoid Kaidim Shiyasa L'derech, like a father who has to throw his son out, but he gives him one last loving kiss and says, look, I have to do this. But if Tzaddik has a completely different approach to this. He says, Kol Man, that the Goyim didn't actually break into the Beis HaMikdash, Klal Yisrael really believed until the last moment it's not going to happen. The Navi said it's going to happen, it wasn't going to happen. Not for real. That was just a warning. It's like when a mother screams at a child, if you don't behave yourself, you don't go to sleep on time, you're not going to go to your aunt's wedding. Everyone knows the child's going to go to the wedding. Navi didn't really mean that if we don't do tshuva, the Beis HaMikdash is going to be destroyed. The attitude was, it's not such a nice thing, the Lashon Hara, the sin and Chinam that's going on, and you hear these threats of destroying the Beis HaMikdash, but none of that is serious. Kol Man, the Goyim didn't break into the Heichel. Klal Yisrael really didn't do tshuva. But at the point that they saw that the Oidim broke into the Heichel, at that moment they said, the Navi is serious. Everybody did tshuva. Simultaneously, with the door of the Kodesh Kedoshim being burst open, all of Klal Yisrael was Mahara B'tshuva. They said, Gevald, what did we do? Why didn't we take the Navi seriously? And even though it was Klar Nigzer Gezeira, but L'maisa, at that moment, Klal Yisrael was considered Oisin Ritzoyin Shel Makkah. And as a result, although Golus was already inevitable, but the birth of Mashiach came right there and then. L'maila, the union of the Nefesh and Ruach of Mashiach already came L'poyel. The seeds of the Geula were implanted. And that is why Chazal say, B'Tisha B'Av Noilud Mashiach. It is every year there is a nefesh of Mashiach that is born on Tisha B'Av. There is an eschaskus. There is a power that is given to the Kayach of Mashiach each year on Tisha B'Av. If we don't make the mistake that the Yidden did during the times of the Beis HaMikdash, and we take this seriously. Now, whatever happens during the week is included in the previous Shabbos. Shabbos is koilo all the brachas that are going to take place during the upcoming week. That's why Shabbos Mevarachim is the Shabbos before. The Chasin gets his Aliyah the Shabbos before. According to the custom of many, the Bar Mitzvah Bacher, a yard site is supposed to get his Aliyah the Shabbos before, because whatever happens during the week, all the brachas come through Shabbos. Shabbos is the conduit for whatever is going to take place during the week. So in a sense, this Shabbos has within it the positive aspects of Tisha B'Av. It doesn't have the negative aspects of Tisha B'Av in it, because Shabbos is only koil brachos and kiddusha. So what are the positive aspects of Tisha B'Av? The fact that the potential for the birth of Mashiach is here. That the Rebbeinu Shalom is saying, look, Klal Yisrael did tshuva when the Goyim broke into the Heichel, but it was too late. But they paved the way, they paved the road, and the Rebbeinu Shalom is waiting for us to take to that road. The Navi says about the days of Mashiach, that everyone's going to be Zoycha to Nevuah. Klal Yisrael will be uplifted to a level beyond the limitations of this world, and the potential is there, Shabbos Chazayin. The way other Sefer Hasidus explain it, Shabbos has to lift the entire week. If this upcoming week is in a sense the most difficult week on the calendar because of Tisha B'Av, so the Shabbos has to be the most powerful Shabbos. And especially this year, that Shabbos itself is Tisha B'Av. The Gemara says in Masechtas Tainus, Tisha B'Av Shechal B'Shabbos Maila Al Shulchanei Yafila Kisuda Shloime B'Shatai. Shloime Melech, of course, represents Klal Yisrael's best period in history. He was the 15th leader of Klal Yisrael, like the 15th day of the month. Sahara B'Shleimusa, the moon in its full color. The Suda of Shloime, as described elaborately in the Gemara Masechtas Bava Metzia, was a tremendous meal that was open for all of Klal Yisrael, for all the people of Yisrael, for all the people of Yehuda, for all of the Shvatim. In other words, every Tisha B'Av, the overwhelming emotion is the Churban, is the Enhag of Avelos. Subconsciously, however, there is the Inyan of Leidos Mashiach, there is the Inyan of the Kruvim Zeh B'Zeh. The Klal Yisrael finally does tshuva and says, okay, we are willing to come back and the road is there. Shabbos Tisha B'Av, so it's in the reverse. That at least the Saresya Klapi Chutz, the overriding emotion on Shabbos has to be a Simcha and an emphasis on Suda Shloima, a Simcha drawing all of Klal Yisrael together. And thus many a Hasidic Sefer types that Rebbe wanted to be Mevatel Tisha B'Av, and Tisha B'Av fell on Shabbos. In other words, if we exercise the positive aspects of here of tshuva, that in a way we have a right to do, even in our level when Shabbos falls on Tisha B'Av, you can undo Tisha B'Av. We can undo the Sinas Chinam. The Chedush Yerim explains Sinas Chinam is made up of two components. One who is Einoi Roa B'Acherim, it bothers him that someone else has it good. And then there's a finer level that he doesn't have an ayin toivel yacher, that he doesn't feel good enough about the fact that someone else has it good. Each on its own level is the sinas chinam that destroys the Beis HaMikdash. And kol shaloi nivne b'yamav ki lu nechrav Beis HaMikdash b'yamav. We're all responsible. On the other hand, it says the toiv ayin hu yivayach. The one who really feels good about someone else, he's the one who's supposed to make the bracha. The one who is on the Midrega to really enjoy someone else's simcha. And he doesn't think, that should have been mine. What should have been mine is mine. What is his, I'm so happy for him. I will do whatever I can to make him even happier. I'll sit down at night and take out a pen and paper and say, what did I do today to make another Yid happy? The Toiv Ayin Hi Yavayrach. If it's the Ayin Hara that destroys the Beis HaMikdash, it is clearly the Toiv Ayin that brings the bracha. And when the Beis HaMikdash is going to be built, who Yivneh Abayis? He's going to be the one that gets the credit for it. Imagine, the Beis HaMikdash is standing, everyone is in Yerushalayim, pushing and shoving to see the Melech HaMashiach, and they're going to call over a couple of people and say, we would like to honor them. They're the ones that caused this day to build the Beis HaMikdash. And we're going to look to see who are these rich people that are being honored, who are these influential people that are being honored, who are these politicians that are being honored, and lo and behold, Moshe, Yankel, Zavel, who are they? What did they do? They were happy for someone else. They were a toivayin. They did what they could to make someone else happy. The toivayin hu yivayrach. Ubezeh concludes the Chedush Yerim once again. Who? Yivneh Abayis. There is a famous story, a marshal probably, about Nebuch, someone who was under the influence of alcohol, constantly drunk, an intelligent person, a father of children, and really a good person. That Nebuch could not control himself. He would wake up okay, but once after Shachris came, he always managed to find a bottle, buy a bottle, and an hour later he was lying on the street with the rest of the drunks, and his family obviously was embarrassed. Embarrassed was an understatement. As much as they spoke to him, as much as they tried to help him, it seemed that their father refused to be helped. On one particular day, it just so happened that their father was not drunk. And two of his children were walking down the street, and they saw a different drunk lying on the floor. His clothes were ripped, rolling from one side of the street to the other. The bottles were clinking in his pocket. And people were standing around laughing. The children were laughing. So one son of the person who usually was drunk but was not drunk on that day said to the other, quickly, let us get father. Let's show him what this other drunk looks like, rolling on the floor this way, with those bottles in his hand and everyone laughing at him. Then father will perhaps get the idea of what he does to himself, of how people laugh at him as well. So the other son said, it's a great idea. They ran home, they got their father, and their father stood there for a long time, and he watched this other drunk continue to roll on the street, the dirt, the laughter, people walking around him, the disgrace. And when they walked back, so one son said to his father, Father, you were watching for a long time and you were shaking your head. I see it left an impression on you. If we may ask, Father, what impression did it leave on you? And the father said, where did he get those bottles from? That schnapps smelled great. I didn't know that that kind of stuff is available here. So the sons had brought him to see one thing, and the father saw something else altogether. They thought they were going to make the situation better. Instead, they made the situation worse. The next day, he ran over to that drunk and found out where to get those bottles that are even stronger. When you try to give mussar to someone, there's always a danger that you're exposing him to greater ideas of hate. And if he's not interested in the mussar, you've done more damage than good. The Moshe Zechon Levracha explains the first Rashi in devarim in a similar manner. And then the pasuk goes on, beremiza, to allude to the different chatoim that Moshe Rabbeinu was giving mussar to Klal Yisrael about. The Ever Hayardain, that's where they actually were, but the pasuk goes on to say Bamidbar. Now they weren't in the Midbar. Why does the pasuk say they were in the Midbar? They were in Aris Mayav now. Rather, Moshe meant to give them mussar about their saying in the Midbar, if only we would have died over here, who asked you to take us to Eretz Yisrael? Ba'arava, in Arava, they weren't in Arava either, but Moshe was meramis to them the chait. Because of Arava, meaning they sinned by Baal Pa'ar, in Shittim, in Aris Mayav, Moel Sof, opposite the Yamsuf. They definitely were not opposite the Yamsuf now, but Moshe Rabbeinu was meramis to them about their complaining by the Yamsuf, saying, Mibli and Kfarim de Mitzrayim, being Paran even Teufel. Never mind that they weren't between Paran and Teufel. There isn't even such a place as Rashi. Rabbi Yochanan tells us, Chazarni al kol mikra v'leimatzinu makom sheshmai Teufel v'lovan. There's no such place. Rather, Moshe was giving them mussar now. Tafel means shetaflu alaman, that they spoke with contempt about the man, which is lavan, which is white. And Paran refers to what they did in the Midbar. In Midbar Paran, that's the Chet HaMeraglim. The Chatzeiros, that refers to the Machlokes of Kairach. The Dizahav, the Dizahav is the Chet HaEgel, that came as a result of an abundance of gold. So you have all of this in one pasuk. Moshe Rabbeinu gave them mussar on the whole 40 years of things that they did wrong. And Moshe doesn't say one thing outright clearly, everything with a remez. Officially, the pasuk is just stating the location. So Rashi tells us, because there are words of mussar, Moshe simply has it over the location of all the chatoim, meaning really to give the mussar about the sins themselves. The skiram, the remez, and Moshe only alluded to them as opposed to speaking about them outright, that make Kloid and show Yisrael out of respect for Klal Yisrael. Amongst the many different explanations for this, besides for the Pashut Shat, the Moshe Zechon explains, we know Chazal tell us, if someone sees the process of the Saita, he should be makabel upon himself in the Zivus. He should stay away from wine. That is why the Parsha of Nazir is right after the Parsha of Saita. Now, what are Chazal concerned with over here? He sees the Saita B'Kulkula. He sees the denigrating process. He sees what happens to this Saita who refused to admit the great bizyonos that she goes through in the Beis HaMikdash, and finally, if Chas v'Shalom, she does not admit and she drinks the water, the terrible death that she suffers. If anything, having witnessed Saita B'Kulkula should within itself be the greatest fence to protect a person from hate. Why would Chazal say that witnessing the Saita process should in fact be a reason that the person has to be more careful? It seems somehow Chazal is suggesting over here that witnessing the Saita process would have possibly a negative effect on him, make him more prone to chait, and therefore he has to take on extra precautions. And why? And the answer is, says Rav Moshe, that if someone has the vestige of chait in him, you can see everything in the framework of how the person is punished, yet the Yetzer Hara is just going to emphasize the chait itself. Just like the story of the shikr. Yes, he sees her punishment. Yes, he sees that everything comes to a din v'cheshbon, but he also realizes the chait took place. And if that chait is something that he is guilty of, whether it's b'maisa, the dibur, or even the machshav, if there is any vestige of this chait within him, true, seeing the einish is going to help, but seeing the chait is a problem on its own. And this is a lesson, says Rav Moshe. When you give someone musar, be careful about spelling out the chait, because it may have exactly the opposite effect. So that's provided, Rav Moshe adds, that you have a way of suggesting the chait and presenting the problem, asking the person to do tshuva, therein, by alluding to it. There were tzaddikim that used to say stories by their tish. And people sitting by the tish understood through those stories, the Rebbe meant me, the Rebbe meant me. If you have a way of doing that, like Moshe Rabbeinu teaches us, that's the way you should do it. But if you don't have a way of doing it, or the person is not getting the message, then you have no choice, and sometimes you have to spell it out. But remember, when you do so, you're taking a chance. Incidentally, Rav Tzadok HaKohen explains, what does the Gemara mean? If Min HaShemayim was b'shered for you to be in the Beis HaMikdash when the Saita process was taking place and you witnessed it, then that is a siman Min HaShemayim, that you have some shaychus to this chait. Again, whether it's b'maisa, b'dibur, or even b'machshava, and you should walk away over here doing extra tshuva. In other words, don't walk away saying, that's Saita, what a wicked lady, she got what she deserved. Chas v'shalom. Walk away saying, if you saw this, there's a siman Min HaShemayim, they're trying to give you a message as well. And that is also an attitude that we ought to have. Seeing someone else stumble into chait. We've mentioned this many times. The Baal Shem HaKadosh says, if you see someone else being over an aveira, try to help him, give him musar, but also remember, if Min HaShemayim it was b'shered that you saw it, it's a message to you as well. Then you must have done something similar to that. You also have to do tshuva. Rav Tzadok quotes the famous story that the Rebbe Reb Zisha was walking down the street, and he passed the peasant who was loading up stacks of hay in a wagon, and he said to him, pass me that stack of hay. And the Rebbe Reb Zisha tried perhaps, or he said even without trying, it's too heavy for me, I can't. I would help you, what should I do? I can't pick it up. And the peasant yelled back, nonsense, you can't. You could, you just don't want to. You don't want to try hard enough. And the entire day the Rebbe Reb Zisha was very shaken. He said, whatever you hear is Min HaShemayim, everything is Hashgacha Pratis. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling him. There are so many more things you can do. But you just decided that you can't. You aren't trying hard enough. Nothing is a coincidence. We mentioned this many times. The Baal Shem Tov saw someone ride in after Shabbos already, and the Baal Shem Tov said, Gewalt, what did I do in terms of Chilul Shabbos that I should see this? And later on he was toilet in the fact that he was not perhaps Meshamish a Talmud Chacham, a certain Talmud Chacham enough, and every Talmud Chacham is the B'china Shabbos, so that was his Chilul Shabbos, for not honoring the Talmud Chacham enough, and he must do tshuva on it. So if you saw the Saita process, Yavir Atzmai Minayayin. And that really explains the kasha over here that many Mefarshim ask. Who was Moshe Rabbeinu giving Musar to? The previous generation had already passed away. This was the next generation, the generation going into Eretz Yisrael. They weren't the ones who sinned by the Chet HaEgel, by the Meraglim. They were the children then. And the answer is the Yismach Yisrael explains a little bit of this. And Hachanami. Most of them were not even there during these Chatayim. But they heard about it. They were raised in this atmosphere. For sure, their fathers and grandfathers described to them what happened, and described to them what happened in the sense of don't make the same mistake. And there is a concern that Seif Kol Seif, it has some type of effect on them. Well, let's remember, we're talking about the Dar Day over here, the Dar Hamidbar. And these Chatarim aren't to be taken at face value. Father Chon used to say over from Tzadikim, from the Averos of the Dar Hamidbar became Torah. From our mitzvahs, we don't have Torah. But still, According to Vir Madrega, Kadosh Baruch Hu is medagdik with tzaddikim kechut hasara. You have over here these points of chait, these 10 nisyonos that they fell through, and Moshe Rabbeinu is addressing the next generation. He isn't addressing the very people that were chayta. He's addressing the generation that may have seen or heard about the Chataim, and even heard about it in the form of, and don't you make the same mistake. But despite that, Moshe Rabbeinu says, you're in danger of carrying over some of that trait. It's in your bloodstream because you were raised with it. And the eighth to that is associating yourself with the tzaddikim of the generations, to be in the right environment. If not, no one is immune. Reb Tzadok HaKayin brings from the Yudah Kaddish of Pershivcha that every single day throughout the entire year, he would learn some psukim from Chumash Devarim. He would say, this is his Musar Sefer. Can you have a better Musar Sefer than the one that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote? And he instructed his Talmidim to do the same. The Ber Moshe from the Yerush Rebbe brings from the Sefer Rish B'yesh from the Nashchiza that in Mishnah Torah you have kol divrei Musar Shabiyolim. The Moshe Rabbeinu took into account every single kind of Musar that any Yid needs until Mashiach comes. The Rebbe Rabbunim of Pershivcha said, let me give you advice to anyone who nafshay chash galoshev the tshuva shleimu lefanav yizbarach shemay, that he learns every single day throughout the entire year some part of Mishnah Torah. That is going to generate his heart to do tshuva. The Ber Moshe says a remes eila hadvarim, eila meaning these words of teichacha, all the words in this sefer, asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. El kol Yisrael means to every single Yid throughout all of the generations. Eila hadvarim, the first words of dvarim are Rashi Tevis, as the Ber Moshe, hashizenu avinu l'feiresecha. Through these words we can come to tshuva. And he brings some v'chayza. That is why in Pasuk Aleph it says Eila advarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael, and later on in Pasuk Gimel it says Diber Moshe el b'nei Yisrael. That particular pasuk is referring to the Musar Moshe Rabbeinu gave to those people. But as an introduction to Chumash Devarim, the pasuk also reminds us that Eila advarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. This kol Yisrael refers not just to all the Yidden that were present then, but it refers to you and me, to every single Yid until Mashiach comes. Now, not everyone likes Musar. Musar, in its purest form, is sometimes difficult to hear. So you have over here Chumash Devarim that is full of Musar. Even Klolos, the Klolos of Parshas Kisavai. Later on, the Yelach and Hazinu, which incidentally the Stipler also writes that if someone has a chasaron in Amunah, he feels that his Amunah isn't the way it's supposed to be, he should say Parshas Hazinu. So fine, we're supposed to say it, we're supposed to say something from Chumash Devarim every single day. Does this, however, mean that Moshe Rabbeinu is sort of angry with us? That we should feel put down? And the answer is, well, Musar means you have to take into account what you did wrong and have charata. And the klolos are definitely scary. But the point isn't that we get depressed from this. Adarab. The greatest blessing and the greatest brachos lies the dafka over here. Now there's an absolutely amazing remes, mamish words of Ruach HaKodesh, that's brought down in the Sefer Ma'aseh Chemed from Rav Michal Weissman Uvachayim Levach. The first beis in Devarim, Eila HaDevarim. It's the sixth ice from the beginning of the Chumash. That's the first beis. The Michal there says, from that beis, count 613 letters. You'll come to a reish. From that reish, count another 613 letters. You'll come to a chaf. From that chaf, count another 613 letters. You'll come to a hey. So with intervals of 613 letters, exactly 613 from the first beis, you spell the word beis, reish, chaf, hey. Bracha. In other words, don't think because these are words of Musar that you should be taken aback by this. You should shy away from it. By concentrating on these words of Musar and on concentrating on the potential klolos and understanding how to deal with it, then you come to the greatest blessing, the greatest bracha that is shayach. If your attitude is a will to indeed receive this Musar from Moshe Rabbeinu and in turn fulfill the Taryag mitzvahs. And that's why it comes with an interval of Taryag of 613 letters in between. Want to be Mekayim the mitzvahs. Just be makabel upon yourself that this is your ultimate objective, and all of these words of Musar and Techacha and Klal are going to turn to the greatest bracha. The Chayzer was once sitting by his Tish Shabbos, and he started saying, you should know I'm a nothing, and I did this wrong, and I did that wrong, and everyone was sort of taken aback, a little surprised, didn't know how to deal with it. So the Chayzer said to them, but on the other hand, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu help you that you don't have any children worse than I am. So they felt bad, and they returned to the table. The Tzaddik Rav Leibel Eiger said, that's what happened by Moshe Rabbeinu. When he started giving Musar to Klal Yisrael, so he started telling them about all the Chatayim, and even though they weren't the ones that Chait, as he explained earlier, the Chidush Yerin says, but the effects of the Chait are in the next generation. We have to deal with those Chatayim until Mashiach comes. So he saw a Chas V'Shalom Achshash of Atzlus amongst the people. So right away, what did Moshe Rabbeinu say? Yes, it's all true. You have to take a deal with these Chatayim, but Yosef Hashem Aleichem Elef Pamim Kachem. In other words, with all this Musar, but I still say Kemoischen Yirbu B'Yisrael. In other words, despite all of this Musar and Techacha, apply the formula of Taryag, and you will see that it really represents the greatest bracha in the world. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter said that the human eye has tremendous capability. It is amazing how far the eye can see. It is amazing how much the eye can see. The peripheral vision of the eye is truly one of the great neflois habayra. But then you take a small coin and you put it directly in front of the eye, and it can see nothing else. Imagine what money does. Imagine what one little small coin can do. The pasuk says, Hashem Elokeichem hirba eschem v'hinchem hayayim kechaychvei hashemayim l'rayv. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu has multiplied you, and behold, you are here to this day as the stars of the heaven, l'rayv, for the multitude. So Rashi asks a kasha. V'chi kechaychvei hashemayim hayabi hayayim. Were they as the stars of heaven on that day? V'haloi lehayu ela shishim riba. There were 600,000 Yidden. And even if you're going to say that takes into account only men over 20, so let's say there were 2 million Yidden then, that's still not kechaychli hashemayim, like the stars of heaven. Mahu v'hinchem hayayim. So what does this mean? Behold, you are this day. And said Rashi, hinchem mishulim kayayim. Moshe Rabbeinu meant to say, you are likened to the day. Kayamim li'olam. You will exist forever. Kachama, the chamavana, the kachavim. Like the sun, like the moon, and the stars. Hitler, Yimach Shemai v'Zichrai, ordered that Jewish artifacts should be taken together. Sefer Torah, mezuzos, shechita knives, pictures, and he wanted a grand museum of the Jews. Let his next generations see that there once was a Jewish people and what they were about. Well, museums tell us what the Nazis were about. If you want to see what we are about, then you have the yeshivas throughout the world. And while the Nazis lay in the same pile of ashes as the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottoman Turks, the Crusaders, the Cossacks, you have now more people, learning in yeshivas probably than since any period, since the Beis HaMikdash stood. But let's take a closer look at Moshe Rabbeinu's mashal. Moshe Rabbeinu tells Klal Yisrael that you are compared to, as Rashi explains it, the sun, the moon, the stars. It's part of the Bria, and you're going to last forever just like they do. It is brought down in the Sefer Lekutei Maharan that the sun itself always bursts forth with its tremendous power and light. It never really diminishes itself. There are many studies that have been done on the sun, and there's very little really known about the sun except that it is this massive ball of explosions of continuous combustions that burst forth, and that we, situated 93 million miles away from it, are just in the right position. A drop closer we couldn't survive due to the heat, a drop further we couldn't survive due to the cold. The sun itself doesn't change, however. The sun continues to shine. The same ball of fire shines 3 o'clock in the morning as well as 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The only difference is the position of the earth as it turns, either exposing us to the sun or blocking us from the sun. The Kedusha of Torah and the Kedusha of the Tzaddik who teaches us Torah shines constantly. However, there is a meniya mitzad b'makabel. We aren't always in a position to feel the presence of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, to feel the Kedusha of Torah, to understand how important our relationship to Tzaddikim are. And it is also the Olam Hazeh, it is the Gashmius of this world that blocks the light, depending on exactly where we're positioned or how deep we dig ourselves in. Quoting a Gemara in Masechtas Eruvin, he explains the entire world, this entire universe, is like a mere pinky, like the small finger, connected what the Torah has to offer us. In terms of our ability to perceive Torah, Torah itself is unlimited. However, if that pinky happens to be blocking, you don't see anything. So how can something so small be a chatzitza to something so great, to something so many thousands of times greater than it is? The answer is it's no different than the coin that blocks the eye in Rav Yisrael Salanter's mashal. You can take the most expensive camera in the world and stand before the Swiss Alps with a telescopic lens, but if the lens cover is on, it's all useless. You may as well be in your own backyard or sitting in your own room. You won't see a thing. So a person gets shakua, the havlei olam hazeh, in the tightness of this world, in the whirlwind of everyday activity. We lose our feshek to daven, to learn. We push ourselves, kimitzvos hanoshim, in lemudam, we just do it out of routine. And we say, well, I don't feel a cheshek. You don't feel a cheshek because the lens cover is on. But in as much as the sun itself is concerned, it burns at night the same way it does during the day. The question is whether or not the artzios, whether the bulk of this earth is blocking it. And therefore, Shlomo Melech says initially, the oirach tzadikim ki or noiga, the light of tzadikim shines like the sun. Just like the sun. It constantly shines. However, depending on where you are, you may or may not see it or feel it. The tzaddikim are constantly shining. But depending on where you are in this world and just how you are involved in yourself and in the taivas of this world, you may or may not feel it. The Talmud Yaakov Yosef brings down from the Baal Shem HaKadosh that the key to the day is the way we say a Hava Rabbah in the morning or a Havas Olam. And it's important to understand this yesod. When we are mispal to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'haya eineinu b'sarasecha, enlighten our eyes in your Torah. We're not asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu to create a yesh mi'ayin, to create something brand new, to say, I have no shaychus to learning, I have no shaychus to Yiras Hashem, to Ahavas Hashem. Create me as a new person. It's not necessary to do that. V'haya eineinu, enlighten our eyes. We are merely asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu to take the lens cover off, to take that little coin out of our eye socket, so that we can see what already exists in front of it, so we can take in the scenery, absorb the light. And this is Moshe Rabbeinu's message to Klal Yisrael. Hashem Elokeichem hir be'echem, v'hinchem hayayim. Just remember, as dark as it is, and as depressed as you may feel on any given day, and as distant as you may feel to a shaychus to Yiddishkeit, to a real geschmack davening, to a Shabbos the way it's supposed to be. Whatever your particular arena in Yiddishkeit is that needs a tikkun, remember, the hinchem hayayim, it's there. The sun is shining. You're not being mispal to recreate yourself. You're just being mispal to remove whatever is blocking your eyes. I've had so many times over the years in the course of the classroom, parents saying to me, Baruch Hashem, what did you do different suddenly, this month than last month? My Baruch, my Moshe, my Yankel started to learn, and I know I didn't do a thing different. And unfortunately, I have definitely received the comment in the other direction as well. Are you doing anything different now? I don't know. Last year, the older brother was doing so much better. Now, there's no question about it. In terms of myself, I may not be doing enough, but I'm not doing anything different. You can prepare the same way. You can teach the same way. You can try to put in the same emotion, but then you have sometimes one sibling that has his eyes open and the other has his eyes blocked. And then you can have the same child, where one term his eyes are closed, or better yet, they're open, but there's something else blocking it. And unfortunately, we live in a society where the things that block it get thicker and thicker. And then suddenly it's removed. Suddenly one day it's removed, and a sane child to whom you felt until now, never mind you weren't penetrating, you weren't even communicating with, suddenly everything opens up. The child learns, he's interested in learning, he's interested in davening. There may have been one readjustment in his social status from one kind of a friend to a different friend, and again, this happens in both directions, Rahman al-Islam. It happens from good to bad as well. And for an outsider, it looks like surely the one who is instructing this child must be doing something different. Either he's doing it better or doing it worse. Sometimes that's the case, but very rarely is that the case. The perception is that way. The reality is it's on the receiving end. If you want to catch the child's attention, then the issue is what exactly is in between you and his eyes? What does he see before he sees whatever you're trying to teach him? I heard once that someone received a new computer, and he was attempting to get it to work, and he couldn't. So there is a number to call, like a helpline that different companies have, where they have technicians sitting around the clock, listening to customers and trying to instruct them how to understand their product. So one person calls up and says, there's something wrong, I'm not receiving my email, I'm not receiving my messages, there's something wrong with your system. He's staring at a blank screen. So the technician, on the other hand, is suggesting press this button, press that button, go to the back of the computer, unplug it, replug it, connect the wire, reconnect the wire. And finally he says to him, you know something? Tell me if a certain light is on, directly underneath the on switch. And the customer asks, which switch? And the technician says, the switch that turns the computer on or off. And the customer says, oh, I didn't know that there's such a switch. Where is it? The technician suggested that he return the computer to the store. And the customer said, why, it can't be fixed? And the technician said, no, the computer is fine, but you're the problem. That customer was very offended, and perhaps the technician ought not to have said it that way, but it still doesn't change the fact. The customer was the problem. There was nothing wrong with the computer. He did not turn on the switch. But we all do the same thing. It's not that the Gemara changes. It's not that Shabbos changes. It's not that the davening changes. But is our switch on or off? Are our eyes open or blocked? The Ber Maim Chaim says a mashal of a man who was sent into prison, and he was promised that as soon as the sun begins to shine outside, he's going to be released. Unfortunately, he was in this dungeon or ditch, and they either forgot about him or intentionally decided to leave him there longer. And he couldn't understand. So many hours are passing by. So many hours are passing by. It seems like days. When is the sun going to shine? When is the sun going to shine? Finally, after a week, they take him out. And he says, my, that was the longest night I've ever experienced. So they explained to him, it wasn't a long night. You just didn't see the light. We forgot about you. If you would have called to us, if you would have reminded us that you're there, then perhaps we would have taken you out. And you would have realized that it was day a long time ago. So the Ber Maim Chaim touched the pasuk of Yadata Hayoim. You will know that it is light even today. When Mashiach is going to come, there will be a Galus Hashchina. There's no question about that. But one cannot imagine what you can be zeicher to even today. When the Hashivaisa Elovecha Ki Hashem Hu Elokim. Then you will know it wasn't night until now. It was the same light, except the light was blocked from you. So Moshe Rabbeinu gives Klal Yisrael really a quick review of their lives. And Moshe Rabbeinu gives them Musar. And he reviews their complaints and their difficulties. But his Hakdama is, just remember all along the light was always shining. When you thought that you're completely frustrated and all is lost and HaKadosh Baruch Hu has left you, the problem was that your eyes were closed. So before Moshe Rabbeinu gives Klal Yisrael Musar about the Meraglim and about the various different complaints that they had and the demonstrations and the frustrations of the moment, Moshe Rabbeinu's Hakdama is now look back. Look back at all those difficulties in life. Look back at those times that you thought all is lost and we're going to die of thirst and hunger and we're going to be killed by the enemy. And think about it now. Don't you see that the sun was shining all along? Don't you see that the problem was your bitachon, your matzav ruchni, now that all is peaceful, now that all is well, now that I'm saying my farewell to you, and that you have survived these years in the Midbar, and you're looking back at Hashem's protective hand and you see the Hashgacha Pratis. Think back to those frustrating moments that Moshe Rabbeinu is now going to enumerate. When you started to complain and yell, we're lost, what's going to happen? Don't you see that the Hinchem Hayoim, that the sun was shining all along? In a crisis, you feel that HaKadosh Baruch Hu left you. That's not the issue. The issue is where your internal on switch is. The light is constantly shining. So what's the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av called? It's called Shabbos Chazayin. What does Chazayin mean? To see, a vision. To see? Shabbos Tisha B'Av is the Shabbos that we see? That's called Shabbos Chazayin. If anything, the greatest day of the year, the happiest day of the year should be called Shabbos Chazayin, the week that we see. The Shabbos before Tisha B'Av should be called Shabbos Darkness. And the answer is, this is exactly the point. Granted it's dark. True. It's Galus. Of course you can't go swimming. And you can't take a shower this week. And you can't wash the clothes. But Chazal wants us to understand why. It's not because the sun is not shining. It's because the shades are down. It is Shabbos Chazayin. Even this Shabbos is Chazayin. The sun shines. We just have to learn how to take the mud out of our eyes. The Bnei Yisachar says, Maimer Gimel Ois Yud Beis. If a person is learning something and he doesn't understand, try your hardest. If it doesn't go, be Mahara B'tshuva. Do tshuva. And then cry over the Galus. Be Misparo for the Geula. And you will see, you will be Zoicha to see the light in something that until now was completely obscure. How does this work? So he explains every Yid has within him a nitzutz of Moshe Rabbeinu, a spark of Moshe. In the Gemara, often we find in a dialogue where one Amoira, one sage would say to the other, Moshe Shapir Kamrit. Now that was a good statement. Because of Galus and the ramifications of Galus, sometimes this spark of Moshe within us gets buried. It's covered up. You don't see the shine. But when you're mispal for the Geula, then it shines, and you understand what you have to understand. Now Chazal tell us, continues the Bnei Yisachar, Kol mi shaloi nivna beis hamikdash b'yamav, if the beis hamikdash was not built in his days, it is as if it was destroyed in his days. Now how can that be? There were many, many great tzaddikim throughout the generations, and the beis hamikdash was not built in their days. But the answer is, when we say whether the beis hamikdash is built or not, we're referring to your particular chelik. Every Yid has a chelik in the beis hamikdash that he is supposed to rebuild through his Torah and mitzvahs. We each have a tafkid down here on this world, and fulfilling that tafkid simultaneously builds our chelik in the Beis HaMikdash. We do our share. And often, explains the Bnei Yisachar, if there is something you simply don't understand in your learning or you're not having any success, it's because you didn't do what you were supposed to do yet. Your chelik in the Beis HaMikdash wasn't built yet. So by doing tshuva, making a cheshbon avaynais, crying over the churban and asking for the geula, you're rebuilding your chelik in the Beis HaMikdash, and you're also simultaneously uncovering what really is within your inner knowledge. And you will see Pelois, says the Bnei Yisachar. You will begin to understand things if you follow this method that you never understood before. The Vilna Gaon says that the 10 seders of devarim each correspond to a different century in the last 1,000 years before Mashiach comes. So really, the whole Chumash devarim and Mishnah Torah is Moshe Rabbeinu's Musar Shmuz to us about how to survive Galus. And we now understand what Moshe Rabbeinu's Hagdama is and what his message is. The Hinchem Hayoim. Understand Hayoim. The sun is shining. Understand you're going to experience difficulties. Understand you're going to be in dark tunnels and you'll think that there's no answer and there are no solutions. The Yesod Hadvarim is the answer is within yourself. The sun shines within every single Yid. The Nitzutz of Moshe Rabbeinu shines within every single Yid. Galus didn't take away the Yeshua Hashchina from us. Galus blocked it. And there's a big difference when you're looking to remove an obstacle or you're looking to create something that's not there yet. If you know it's just an obstacle and you know the sun is there shining behind it, it makes it so much easier to try to pursue it. And that's Moshe Rabbeinu's message. Don't give up in the face of darkness. V'yadata hayoim v'ashivayse el levavecha. Hashem Elokeichem here be'eschem v'hinchem hayoim. The sun is shining. You are here, Rashi says. You are likened to the day. Kayomim li'olam. We just have to be mispalel to learn how to remove the dark lens cover. The Medrash tells us that there were 3 people that said the word Eicha. Moshe Rabbeinu, as we read in Parshas Devarim, and we read it as the minig is with an Eicha nigun. Eicha esalavadi, tarchachem u'masachem, derivchem. How can I, myself alone, bear tarchachem, the tircha, the burden, u'masachem, the difficulties that you have placed upon me, the derivchem, and your strife? Rashi says tarchachem means that the Yidden were troublesome. If one of them saw in a din Torah that his opponent was winning, it wasn't easy for a Yid to give in. He would say, wait, I have additional witnesses, I have more rayas to bring. That's tarchachem. U'masachem means that wherever Moshe Rabbeinu went, there always was an element that doubted him, that questioned him. If he came out too early, they said, why is he in such a rush this morning? Maybe there's no peace in his house. If he came out late, they said, why is he coming out late? Who knows what he's thinking about us? And of course, Chas v'Shalom, this is not the general opinion of Klal Yisrael. It was the extremists, it was the Erev Rav, but extremists have their influence even on the centerists, even on the people in the middle. Furthermore, even if someone has a ridiculous extremist view, and everyone says, nah, how could you say that? Well, the Maisa, during a time of crisis, when a person is under pressure, so it sort of surfaces, and you begin to wonder, maybe that person is right. So we're talking about a tiny nakud over here, a dakash of how it affected the mainstream of Klal Yisrael. But still, given what Moshe Rabbeinu did for Klal Yisrael, so Moshe Rabbeinu refers to this as a terrible burden that was upon him. And the constant fighting, the infighting between Yidden, which unfortunately we have not solved yet. If we did, there would be no need to read this pasuk in Eicha Nigun. There would be no need to read Eicha at all, because the Beis HaMikdash would be built. That's how Rashi types the word. The Ramban explains Tarchachem u'Masachem Zerivchem differently. Moshe Rabbeinu says, how can I carry this tremendous achrayus, this tremendous burden? Masachem, says the Ramban, refers to the Masad V'Hashem that is incumbent upon the Navi, or the Chacham, or the Gadol Adar. He has the achrayus to continuously be mispawel and to be oisik in the Tzarchei HaKlal. We know how the Chazon Ish was not mevatel a single second. He never actually went to bed. He fell into bed only after all of his kaiches had been exhausted. And yet somebody once came into the Chazon Ish and he saw him sitting with a couple, a person from Poland and his wife, and they had a shop where they sold needles and threads. And the Chazon Ish was going through the whole inventory with them. And they were catching this type of a thread, that type of a thread. Should they put up this type of a sign, that type of a sign, this type of a price, that type of a price? What should they do with the garbage, and so on and so on? The Chazon Ish spent several hours with them. And someone said, Rabbi, how could you spend so many hours on such a mundane thing? And the Chazon Ish said, what are you talking about? These are refugees that just came from the war. They had now an opportunity of setting up a business for themselves, to establish themselves. I survived the war. You don't think I have an achrayus for every single yid that I can help? And I see they're not doing it right, to sit down to straighten them out and to give them guidance? That's the Masad V'Hashem that is incumbent upon the Navi and the Chacham to be mispawel, to be oisik in Tzarchei Klal Yisrael. So that, says the Ramban, is the taich of the word U'Masachem. That is the difficult pekel that the Gadol Hadar has to carry. Tarchachem, your burden, that is the burden of teaching. That is Lilmod Ulamed in Talmidim. The Gadol Hadar, the Rav of the Shul, the Tzaddik may sit down and say shir after shir on something that he has already learned 1,000 times, because this is what the Talmidim have to hear, this is what a certain age group has to hear, this is what a particular group of people in the shul have to hear in order to really benefit from the little time they have to learn. In this time, the Rav can learn Zohar, he can finish Shas, he can learn so much more. Yet he has a responsibility. This is the Tircha. The Baruch Ber once said that he could have finished Shas so many more times, and there were so many mitzvahs in Torah that he never dwelled in as much as he thought he could have, but he had to sacrifice himself for his Talmidim. He had to teach them what they had to know, what they needed in order to be established and to become the Rosh Yeshiva of the next generation. That was one of his greatest sacrifices in life. Heard from the Rosh Yeshiva of Pamdol, sein gesund, ever full shalema, that the Baruch Ber, during a time of war, when he was a young man, it was World War I, and bombs were falling on the street, and he went out to give his shir, and he saw there was no one on the street, and people are running in all different directions, and he ran back into his house. And his father told him, what's the matter with you? You have an achrayus to teach. He said, Father, there are bombs falling on the street. And his father felt, and of course this is not a hurrah for anybody, but he felt under the circumstances that their lives were anyway in peril, and Torah was being threatened,
And there are certain people that have to be Moshe Nefesh themselves. And for a father to say that to his son is not simple. So Baruch Ber said he went out. It was one of the most scariest walks he ever took, those couple of blocks. And indeed, he found some of the Talmidim, and he gave shiur that day and returned to his house with the bombs falling around him. And he later said that he gave a shiur in a Rashba, and he felt that he was zeicha to understand a deep nekuda in that Rashba, and that was his reward, that was his char for being Moshe Nefesh himself and walking through those dangerous streets at that time. Rosh Hashiva said, can you think about this? Think about this nekuda for a moment. Never mind that he walked through the streets with the bombs falling. But if we would do a thing like that, we would wait for schar. We would anticipate reward, bane, chayim, zayne, family, children, riches, security. The Baruch Ber was malei simcha. He understood a deeper nekuda in the Rashba because he was Moshe Nefesh himself to teach this to his Talmidim. More than walking between the bombs, this is the most amazing part of the story. What the Baruch Ber's hasaga of reward is. And this is the terchachem, the complete Mesiras Nefesh for teaching, the achrayus to teach. The Klal Yisrael indeed, unfortunately, are constantly fighting with each other. But the aspect of how the Talmud Chacham is involved is, it is now incumbent upon him to try to solve those disputes and to do whatever he can to make shalom. And that can take up a good deal of his day. So the emes is the way Rashi teaches these three words. Terchachem u'mesamchem v'rivchem, and the way the Ramban teaches it, it seems to be going in completely opposite directions. Rashi teaches it in a very negative sense. Terchachem, as we explained before, they're troublesome. They're never willing to admit that they're wrong. U'mesachem, they're always doubting Moshe Rabbeinu, speaking behind his back. They're constantly fighting. And the Ramban teaches each of these words in a positive sense. Difficult, but positive, in sense of what the responsibility of the Gadol Hador is. He has to teach. He has to be mispal for them. He has to show the way. He has to make shalom between them. When I once heard a Meir de Kavart, there's no steer between Rashi and the Ramban. They're both saying the same thing. Tarchachem. Yes, originally Klal Yisrael were Tarchonim. No way that person's going to win. Hold it, I'm not asking, I'm going to bring more rayas. And Moshe Rabbeinu sat down and learned with them and had patience and learned with them again and again and again until he changed them. And he taught them about life and he taught them about giving in. And he changed this attitude. U'mesachem. They doubted Moshe Rabbeinu, they questioned Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu responded not by firing back at them and say, how dare you say that about me? He responded by being mispal for them, by working with them, by showing his love for them, with the exception of Dasan and Aviram, who showed that chutzpah to Moshe Rabbeinu overcame them. He overcame his antagonists with love. The Rivchem that they were very difficult, and there was a tremendous amount of internal dispute. Yes, and Moshe Rabbeinu solved those disputes. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu was not saying that he gave up. Adarabah. Rashi and Ramban complement each other. Moshe Rabbeinu is explaining how difficult the situation was, and therefore, knowing what his responsibilities are as the leader of Klal Yisrael, how much Mesiras Nefesh it required in order to solve these problems, which Moshe Rabbeinu indeed solved, but it took a lifetime of effort. Now the Medrash says, famous Medrash, that there were three that began Eicha. Moshe said, Eicha Esa Levadi, how can I carry upon myself this difficult load? And the way Rashi explains it, they were difficult people. But then Yeshaya comes, and Yeshaya says, what? How did this happen to Yeshalayim? Eicha Haisa Lezayna Kiryan Amona. So it's interesting. Moshe Rabbeinu says that there was a lack of amunah and honesty amongst them. That's what apparently he was complaining about, the way Rashi learns. And then Yeshaya comes and says, what happened? Klal Yisrael was such a trusted people. And now, look what happened to Yeshalayim. If he was referring to what Moshe Rabbeinu said, and the Medrash says there's a connection, but Moshe Rabbeinu's point that they were not such a trusted and honest people. And then comes Yirmiyah. What does Yirmiyah say? Eicha Yashva Badat Ha'ir. How can this city of Yerushalayim remain so desolate? A city that was so respected amongst the Goyim. But wait a second. What was Yirmiyah referring to? Was he referring to his predecessor, to Yeshaya? But Yeshaya's complaint was that the city was no longer respected amongst the Goyim. That it was Eicha Haisa L'Zayna Kiryan Aman. I'm sorry for it because you have to put things into perspective, and then you'll understand exactly what all these Nevi'im are saying. When Moshe Rabbeinu refers to Klal Yisrael as Terchachem U'Masachem V'Rivchem, Moshe Rabbeinu expected of Klal Yisrael perfection. This is the Dar HaMidbar, this is the Dar Deya, this is the Dar that heard Anochi Hashem Elokecha. And when Moshe Rabbeinu says there was an akuda of strife between them, or there was an akuda of, but maybe I'm right, or there was an akuda of doubt in Moshe Rabbeinu. You think this was the general opinion of the masses, that the editorials kept on hacking on Moshe Rabbeinu again and again, that there were wild protests and demonstrations? These were isolated incidents during times of unimaginable crisis, being alone in the midbar without water and so on. And they came from extremists and isolated groups, but there was a nakuda, a daka shebedaka of a nakuda, a tiny, tiny little doubt that may have infiltrated into the minds of Klal Yisrael. It may have been for a fleeting quarter of a second. The inability to get along that Moshe Rabbeinu was talking about is not our hasaga of what it means not to get along. If we don't get the right aliyah, we walk out and daven in the next shul, or worse, make the next shul. That's not what Moshe Rabbeinu was talking about. Moshe Rabbeinu was talking about a tiny, fleeting machshava that was corrected right away. But Moshe Rabbeinu had tinus. Why should Klal Yisrael even have such a machshava for a split second of jealousy or of frustration? Moshe Rabbeinu wanted perfection from the generation that heard Kabbalah Satire. A couple of generations later, obviously a lot more than a couple of generations later, but referring to this, comes Yeshaya, and Yeshaya says, Geralt, look what's happening now. Moshe Rabbeinu called the Dor HaMidbar a lack of honesty. He was demanding such a level of perfection. By today's standards, if we could only have the kind of shalom that they had in the Dor HaMidbar, by today's standards of Yeshaya, if we could only have that hasaga of honesty, if we could only have that type of amunah and a tzaddik that they had, how this would be the criticism of us that there was a fleeting moment of doubt. So Yeshaya looks at that and he says, where are those chatayim? Where are those criticisms of Moshe Rabbeinu? If we could only apply that level of criticism to today, how lucky we would be. By today's standards, what Moshe Rabbeinu considered tircha would be considered the epitome of honesty. And a while later, comes Yirmiyah Hanavi, and Yirmiyah says, Yeshaya was complaining. Nebuch of Yeshaya would see what's going on today. By today's standards, if we only had the lifestyle, the level of amunah, the respect of the nations that was during the times of Yeshaya, Yeshaya called out Yerushalayim standing alone. By today's standards, we would say that is the greatest of respect. If unfortunately you see how things unraveled. Yeshaya was complaining that the city turned but at least in terms of how you measure them up against the Yom HaSu'olam, Yerushalayim stood above it. The morals of Yerushalayim, the Kiddush of Yerushalayim was still way above the Yom HaSu'olam. Yeshaya wanted more. Yeshaya said it's not enough to say that we're better than the Yom HaSu'olam. But Yirmiyah cries and he says we lost that as well. How Levi we had the level of Kiddush that we had during the times of Yeshaya. And that is why, explains from Sefer, you have each of these three subsequent Nevi'im referring to the criticism of the previous generation in terms of a compliment. Father Chanukah once told me that there was a Weltzvart in his town. From the Avelis of the Dor HaMidbar L'maisa, it became Torah. If you're missing the Parsha of the Egel or the Parsha of Kairach in your Sefer Torah, the Sefer Torah is possible. From our mitzvahs, it's true we create heavenly worlds, but we don't quite create sukkim in the Torah. We have no musik, we have no understanding who these people were. But the higher the level of a person, then the greater the nekuda of chait. The chayzer once went to Tashlach, and the minute gives you sort of empty your pockets, as if to say you're throwing your chatayim into the water. Of course, it takes a lot more than that, but that's a symbol for us to remember that we have to do tshuva to the extent where we are emptied of all of our chatayim. And one of the Hasidim, one of the Talmidim of the Chayzer, was crawling on the floor, symbolically scooping things up. They said to him, what are you doing? He said, I guarantee you that the Rebbe's of Eirais, for me, they would be mitzvahs. When he throws out, I want to take it. Moshe Rabbeinu said, Echa esol avadi tarchachem umasachem derivchem. The Rashi Tevis of tarchachem umasachem derivchem says the Chassam Sofer is mem for masachem. That's the Shirish, begins with a mem. Tarchachem is a tes. And Rivchem is a reish that's motor. Rain, parnasa. Moshe Rabbeinu was Mesakin Klal Yisrael. Any element of hatred, any element of lack of cooperation, Moshe Rabbeinu showered them with love, with Mesiras Nefesh, and therefore he was Mamshech Parnasa, he was Mamshech the rain, the Hamshacha L'Doyrais, the union of learning from Tzadikim, Mispashtusa de Moshe B'chol Dar V'Dar, in every generation the Kiddush of Moshe Rabbeinu shines through the Gedolei Hadar. That's the rain. Unfortunately, as Klal Yisrael drifted away from the tikkun that Moshe Rabbeinu was masakin for them, the rain stops. The siyata d'shemaya doesn't completely stop, chas v'shalom, but it is diminished. Now Yeshaya said that as a result of Klal Yisrael's chatoyim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, on the clouds I have commanded that they cease providing rain. The oz and then, Yavesh HaMa'ayin, the wells are going to be dried. The trees are going to wither. There's dak and ill, and the trees will become old, and they won't provide the fruit. And therefore Yeshaya said, Eicha Haisel Zayna Kiryan Amana. Zayna Kiryan Amana says the Chum Sofer is Rashi Teva Zakan. In other words, these fresh fruits, this hamshacha of rain, this kiddush of being makabel from the Gedolei Hadar, that Moshe Rabbeinu implanted into Klal Yisrael and Lamaisa is the source of our emunah and is the chain we will hold on to until Mashiach. But look how old it has become. Look how the clouds have been held back. Look how dried up the trees have become. Because we are not willing to live up to those ideals, and we aren't listening to the tzaddikim and the chacham in the way we did in previous generations. And Yirmiyah came further and he said, but at least Klal Yisrael held together. They weren't listening the way that they were supposed to. The fruits weren't as fresh as the way they were supposed to, but as long as there was some type of achdus amongst them, there was a kiyum. But when machlokes comes, then we fall apart altogether. And what did Yirmiyah say? Yirmiyah said, Eicha Yashva Badad Ha'ir. Aleph, Yud, Beis, Hey. The Rashi Teva says, Eicha Yashva Badad Ha'ir says the Chum Sofer is Eva. Eva. The kind of hatred that the pasuk describes between the human being and the snake. That kind of a relationship. That was the lack of trust. That was the undercutting. That was the inability to fagin in yanim, to allow that someone else is having it better than you are. That is what is going to completely undo us. So if we're going to correct this and rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, we have to work our way backwards. We have to first put together what was dismantled last. Eva. If we correct the Eva, then Yirmiyah no longer has to say Eicha Yashva Badad Ha'ir. And when we correct the strife that is between us, then we can focus our attention on listening to the Chachamim, listening to the Tzaddikim, subjecting ourselves to guidance, and then we correct the Zakan, the Eicha Haisel Zayna Kirya Namana, the trees becoming old, the rain that was held back. And once we have corrected the Eva, and once we are drawn together and we raise our standards in unity as a nation, so the old trees become young trees, the dried up wells become fresh wells, the clouds that have been ordered to hold back the rain begin to produce the rain, and then we come back to Moshe Rabbeinu's matter. Then we go back from Yeshaya to Moshe Rabbeinu to the Eicha Esa Levadi Tarchachem Umesavchem V'Rivchem, where Moshe Rabbeinu says, as long as you are together and as long as you are willing to listen, as difficult as you may be, I can help you turn your situation into the greatest source of bracha, into the makar of rain that is going to provide for you and all generations after.
The Ezer HaYarden, beyond the Yarden, the Eretz Moav, and the land of Moav, Hoyel Moshe, the Eretz HaTorah Azayis Leimer. Moshe began to expound on the Torah. What does that mean? He expounded or clarified the Torah? Rashi tells us, the Eretz HaTorah, B'shivim Loshain Per Shalahem. He explained it to them in 70 languages. Now, I would presume all the Yidden of that time spoke Lashon HaKodesh. They all heard the Aseret HaDibros in Lashon HaKodesh. Moshe Rabbeinu taught them in Lashon HaKodesh until now. Why was it necessary now for Moshe Rabbeinu to repeat the entire Torah in all 70 different languages? Is it conceivable to suggest that there was a Yid over there who only understood Portuguese or only spoke Icelandic or Persian? What happened for 40 years until now? The Kedushas Levi explains this wasn't just a translation. Moshe Rabbeinu was making something very clear to Klal Yisrael, and he was also establishing certain communication lines, b'metzias. In Moshe's goodbye to Klal Yisrael, he explains to them, and to them that means to us, that there's going to be galus, and you're going to wander around this world. But don't think that somehow you're in an area that is beyond the limits of Torah. Because this entire planet has been prepared for Kedushas HaTorah. We even find, explains the Kedushas Levi, some rare exceptions of where other languages appear in the Torah itself, where there is Targum Lashon in the Torah, like Yegar Sahadusa,
or taitafes. What does the word taitafes mean? The Gemara darshans that tat, tes, in the language of the Caspians means two, and the second part of the word, the pei saf, in a different African language also means two. So taitafes refers to two and two, the four parshias in the tefillin. Now the Chidush Yarim asks, so if the Torah wants to explain to us or describe to us that tefillin has four parshias, the Torah has no other way to do it other than to quote Caspian or to quote some African language? Suddenly there's a shortage of words? But the answer is, explains the Chidush Yarim, and that's in line with what the Kedushas Levi is going to explain to us. Tefillin is the p'china of the Rohu Kol Ami Oretz Ki Shem Hashem Nikra Lecha V'Yar Mimeka, that regardless of where a Yid is, he remembers that he is a Yid, and he makes that statement very clear. But lest the person think that that was intended only for the Kedusha of Meir Sha'arim. Maybe a person thinks, well, in Lakewood I could put on tefillin, in Borough Park I can put on tefillin, but when I'm in Taiwan, or when I'm spending a night in Kentucky, tefillin wasn't intended for here. Surely HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't expect me to put on these parshias over here and to present myself as a Yid. So therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that the very origins of tefillin are going to be presented in the most remote of languages. Because this message, the belief in the principles of tefillin, our emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yitzias Mitzrayim, the constant effort of our mind and heart being directed toward Hashem, there's no place where it doesn't apply, where it's out of bounds, where you're out of this jurisdiction. And should a Yid say, look, but I can't, I'm just too lonely, I'm too isolated? Then the answer to that is that the foundation of tefillin was given to us in the most remote form possible, to tell you that if you want, you could. It's here. It's been prepared for you. And that's Moshe Rabbeinu's message to Klal Yisrael. Zok the Kedushas Levi, the language of every ummah is the chiyus of that ummah. It's what gives them life. It's what identifies them. It's what binds them. It's what unifies them. Think about this for a moment. The British took over all of the colonies in North America, or at least most of them, and they insisted that from now on you have to speak English. Because they understood that if the Dutch in New York are going to continue to speak their language, and the French will speak their language, and the Spanish will speak their language, then we don't have control over a unified country under our domain. And we're trying to manage splinters. And the British knew that's not going to work. So they forced English on all of the colonies that they took control of. And it's interesting to look at the history of this, because in the one area that they were somewhat lenient about this, in Quebec, where the people still speak French, or some of the people still speak French to this day. So it's not just a different language, the whole culture is different. Attitudes are different. Laws are different. And there's a whole to-do, a constant controversy about Quebec breaking off from the rest of Canada, which they have the constitutional right to do technically. All because of a language. And the Kedushas Lady says this is more than just psychological. It's a metzias. The language is the chiyus of an ummah. The language is the life of a nation. You take away their language, you take away their independent chiyus. Lashon HaKodesh is the language of Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael heard the Torah on Sinai only in Lashon Kodesh. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says the Kedushas Levi, Hamabit Meireshis Achris, saw that Klal Yisrael is going to be in Galus, and they are going to be in a situation where they will be threatened by other languages that could undo that Lashon Kodesh within them. So from the name HaKadosh Baruch Hu has B'davka inserted other languages, even though it's with very rare exceptions, but L'maisa it does appear in the Torah, because that gives a Yid a handle to hold on to. That as a similar as he may think he is, there always is a way back. Torah can find itself into your heart regardless. Thus the Pasuk says, Hashem Yispar B'chsoiv Amin Zayulat Shem Selah. The Rebbeinu Shem counted out some words, says the Kedushas Levi, in the language of the nations, so that wherever a Yid is, wherever he is born, regardless of what he is surrounded with, the tzaddik can emerge and be mashpia the kedusha. That yulad sham sela. That refers to the tzaddik. As the lashon Chazal is kol ha'olam lo nivra ela l'tzavis lezeh. And wherever he is born, anywhere on the globe, the neshama of that tzaddik can blossom. The connections are there. And that is also the meaning of what Rashi says that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote over the Torah in 70 different languages. Moshe Rabbeinu was making it very clear to Klal Yisrael. And as we said before, that refers to us as well. Because in devarim, Moshe Rabbeinu talks to every single Yid until Mashiach comes. As the Ber Moshe brings, Eila hadvarim ashadiva Moshe el kol Yisrael. Kol Yisrael means every single Yid until Mashiach comes. So the Rebbeinu Shalom showed Moshe Rabbeinu everybody. Dar dar v'darsha. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to each and every one of us, I know who you are. I know how many times you were sent down to this world. I know where you live. I know what your nisyonos are. I know what your struggles are. I know what your difficulties are. And I'm not saying it's easy, but if you want, it's there for you. It has been prepared for you in any language. The instruction book of the Torah, the instructions for our neshama and our hearts and mind have been printed in all languages. Did you ever buy a watch and you see there's an instruction manual over there? And it's a real thick manual, and I'm convinced they do that to make you think, imagine how many features this watch has, or this blender has, or this microwave has, if the manual is so thick. And then when you take it home and you start reading the manual, you see, of course it's thick, because there are 10 pages in English, 10 pages in Spanish, 10 pages in French, 10 pages in Japanese, 10 pages in Chinese. But on the other hand, think about the meaning of this for a moment. The company who produces this watch, his dream is that every person in the world, on all four corners of the globe, should be wearing this watch. There's no racism, there's no sinna, there's no prejudice. He doesn't care what language you speak, he doesn't care what color your skin is, he doesn't care what religion you believe in. He wants one thing, that if you want to wear his watch, there are instructions for you to be able to wear it. If you can forgive the analogy, this is what the Kedushas Levi is saying. Hayol Moshe be'eretz ha'Torah azos, Zakrashi b'shivim loshen in all 70 languages. Moshe Rabbeinu says, trust me. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants you as a human being, regardless of who you are, to fulfill your mission on this world. And if you have the ratzon and you have the determination, the instructions are there. Even if you're in the Eretz Moav. Moav, you have to remember, represented the koach that was machtia Klal Yisrael, that enticed them to sin and cause such terrible magefos. Moshe Rabbeinu said, even here, it doesn't make a difference how low you have fallen. If you're looking to come back, just know, search hard enough and the instructions have already been printed. The Marvashamish asks that it would appear that Hayol Moshe B'eretz ha'Torah azos is out of place. Parshas Devarim begins with Moshe Rabbeinu giving Klal Yisrael Musar. Then you have this pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote over the entire Torah, b'shivim l'shonos, in all 70 languages. And then the Musar continues basically throughout the rest of the Devarim into the Yochanan. And then you have the halachis of the Torah. You have the Aseret Dibros, and Moshe Rabbeinu starts chazering over all of the mitzvahs. So l'cha'orah, this pasuk should have been in Parshas Yochanan, right before the Aseret Dibros. In other words, when Moshe Rabbeinu finishes the Musar drasha, right before he begins to teach them Torah, it should say, you should know, Moshe Rabbeinu wrote over the Torah in 70 languages for everyone to understand. Why is it over here like in the middle of the Devarim? The Marv Shamash reminds us that a Yid is supposed to do tshuva before he starts learning Torah. When you do tshuva, your whole Torah is different. That doesn't mean, all right, I'm not going to learn today because I have to do tshuva, and one day I'll get around to do tshuva. What it means is, when the Yid opens the Sefer, you stop for a few moments and you say, Rabbeinu Shalom, I really want to be good. I regret the past, I want to be makabel the future, I sinned, and then start learning. Those little machshavos of tshuva before you start learning opens up whole different doors in Torah. If a person doesn't do that, then he runs the danger of falling into the category of what the pasuk says, Ula Rasha, Amar Elokim, to the wicked one. Hashem says, Malach alasaper chukai. What right do you have to repeat my statutes, my words? So, this is what happened over here. Everyone knows now Moshe Rabbeinu is giving his last lectures to Klal Yisrael. It's an emotional time between Klal Yisrael and Moshe Rabbeinu. But let's bear in mind, incidentally, that the whole Chumash Devarim took place in a relatively very short period of time. The Orach Chaim HaKadosh makes a cheshbon. The Devarim begins Rosh Chodesh Shvat. For Chazal tell us, Hoyel Moshe Be'er Es HaTorah Azos, the day that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote over the Torah in the 70 languages was Rosh Chodesh Shvat. So that's when Devarim began, and Moshe Rabbeinu was nifta on Zayin Adar. So you're only talking about 36 days. As a matter of fact, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh says that's Eila HaDvarim. Eila is Gematria 36. In these 36 days, Moshe Rabbeinu has to convey everything to Klal Yisrael. He has to give over the whole message. So the Yidden are running over here with their notebooks and pens, and they're saying, "Oh, Moshe Rabbeinu, give us chizik for Galus. Review one more time Kol HaTorah Kula, because after you, no Navi could be mechadish anything. It's only what we understand from your words." And everyone is all excited, and they're waiting for this last Geshmak Shir, this real Chazara Shir over Kol HaTorah Kula. And what do they hear? Moshe Rabbeinu starts giving them Nusser. And he says, look, there are things we have to correct over here. You have to look into your past and realize that you're responsible for your actions. You have to come to terms with what you did. And he gives very veiled references to the Chet HaEgel, the Chet HaMeraglim, and so on. But all of a sudden, Moshe Rabbeinu stops. Klal Yisrael is staring at each other. They're very disheartened. Moshe Rabbeinu, don't you love us? Don't you care for us? I mean, we only have 36 days to review what you taught us over the last 40 years. And we have the monumental task, we have the immense burden of being the foundation to be able to memorize all of this and then transmit it to the next generation in such a way that the Torah stays intact until Mashiach comes. Every moment is precious. You're giving us Musa? You're telling us our averos and the sins that we committed? Moshe Rabbeinu was concerned over that maybe Klal Yisrael was getting the wrong idea. Maybe Klal Yisrael was under the impression that they had sinned so much, there's no point in learning. Maybe Klal Yisrael was getting the wrong idea after they heard Moshe Rabbeinu's opening remarks of Musa, that what he's really telling them is, don't expect to hear a shir from me, because forget it, you lost your opportunity. So Moshe Rabbeinu starts the Musa and stops right there and then says, wait. Understand over here what I am doing. We are now going to write over the Torah, the Shivim L'Shonos. It's going to be available for every single person throughout the Doros. I am not trying to send you away with this Musar. I'm not reminding you of your Chatoim so that you should get discouraged and say, well, it's not worth it, or you don't need me. Adrabah, Chas v'Shalom, just the opposite. Because I know how important this Torah is that I'm going to teach you. Adrabah, because all future generations are going to stand on the Torah that you absorb, therefore I need you to do tshuva before you start learning. So in a sense, the Hoyel Moshe Be'er Es HaTorah Azos that sort of pops up over here at the beginning of Devarim, right after the first words of Musa, is Moshe Rabbeinu's way of saying, wait, you're getting the wrong idea. I'm not sending you away. I'm cleaning you. I'm clearing the window so you can see better. I'm teaching you how you do tshuva before you start learning. So as a result, your whole Torah is a different kind of a Torah. Moshe goes back to the Musar, all the way until Parshas V'Yoschanan. But now we see the sequence. Moshe begins by giving them Musar, stops right there and then says, no, understand the purpose of this Musar. I'm not saying you're not worthy of learning Torah. Adarabah. Let me explain to you what the objective of this Musar is. It's Hoyel Moshe Be'er Es HaTorah Azos, the Shivim L'Shonos, that every single Yid can be Zocher to learn Torah regardless of who he is and where he is. That's the purpose of this Musar. The objective is to bring you closer to Torah, to make your Torah more meaningful, so that your Torah binds you to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not to send you away. So So after Moshe Rabbeinu clarified that with the Eretz, the Torah Hazayis, he returns to the Musar. But now Klal Yisrael understands what Moshe Rabbeinu means with his Teichacha. Now it's interesting to note, Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to them about the Chet Ego, and he's talking to them about the Chet HaMeraglim in a veiled way. Most of these people weren't there. This is the next generation. So the Yochai HaKadosh says, well, you have the people that were under 20, even though they weren't punished min hashamayim, but Lamaisa Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to cleanse them from the negative effects of those chatayim. The Sosanis brings a different inyan over here. He says Lamaisa, every person is supposed to do tshuva on the chatayim of his parents, because a chet that a father does leaves its mark on a son. Just like he's the Yerush to good things, he's Yerush to negative qualities also. And if someone knows that his parents were flawed in a specific nekuda, adarabah, it's a chus for the parents and a chus for him that he should put extra emphasis on cleansing himself in that inyan. And this was Moshe Rabbeinu's message to Klal Yisrael. And that's why Kol Dor Shelo Nivna Beis HaMikdash B'Yamav, says the Sfas Emes, is Kilu Nechrav B'Yamav. For if every generation would correct the chatayim of the past, would have long corrected the original sin of Chinam that destroyed the Beis HaMikdash.
This shiur is distributed by Kol Hadas, 11 Stei Chenet Street, Yerushalayim. For donations, please call 02-5383-999. Fax 02-538-0267. Postbox 57035.